cracks and bones. Posted by Won't Think Straight. The more stories I collect, the more I start to question what our reality actually is. Like Plato's allegory of the cave, perhaps what we think of as real is nothing more than flickering shadows across a dim wall. Our minds try their best to piece together these echoes of reality with our limited senses, but the great world of truth lies beyond our reach and comprehension. But there are some of us who can, and do perceive reality very differently to rest of us. After reading my last two stories, my friend Steve spoke of one of these people, his ex-girlfriend Christine. They had met at university where they attended the same psychology course. From the first time he saw her, he knew that she was special. She had an otherworldly quality to her, mixed with a strange intensity that he saw in few others. She was exceptionally bright, almost inhumanly so, and it took several weeks of relentless courting before she relented to finally start dating him. It was months into their relationship that Steve was able to piece together why Christine was like no other person he had known. Christine was an individual with a rare form of synesthesia, which gave her a very unique perspective on the world. She processed stimuli in a very different way. Her brain mixed up her senses so she could hear colors, smell sounds, or even taste numbers. She was a genius at mathematics because she could intuitively feel the right answers. They would taste right to her. She had this ability for as long as she could remember. Growing up, she had assumed everyone could do it too. It was not until third grade, when she asked her teacher why the school bell always smelled like oranges, did she discover she was different. Her classmates would laugh at her and call her a freak. So she would avoid talking about her abilities, and kept it secret throughout high school. Her synesthesia only got stronger as she got older. By the time high school ended, she had already decided to devote herself to the study of the human mind so she could learn more about herself. Steve was the first person since primary school that she had trusted enough to tell. She had loved the fact Steve was also a psychology major, and was just as intrigued as she was about her ability. They spent countless hours discussing how she experienced the world, which was so much richer and varied than he could imagine. She told him that the number 1 tasted like chocolate, 3 was cinnamon, 6 was garlic, and 8 was cut grass. For her, doing multiplications, for example, was like cooking. She could taste the result and know if the answer was right. It seemed as if she experienced a whole new other world that no one else sensed. The most intense of her sensations were for colors. Each color had a unique voice and personality that spoke to her, especially when she touched it. Red was an old woman, kind and gentle, like a grandmother. Blue was angry and impatient, constantly rushing her. Green was stern and strict, whilst yellow was proud and arrogant. Black was pure silence, the absence of all sound. Her favorite was white, seductive and passionate. She loved wearing white. There was one color she truly feared, though, dark gray. Even just a shade above black, and she would start to hear whispers rising from the silence. A few shades lighter, and the voices would get louder. Evil voices, whispering in her ear, delighting in telling her how her skin would be flayed strip by strip from her conscious body, how her flesh would be devoured and torn from her bones while she was awake, how her eyeballs would be scooped from her skull so she could see 1,000 pointed teeth tearing at her face. Needless to say, she hated nighttime and the dark. She had to always sleep with the lights on, and with sleeping tablets so she wouldn't dream when her eyes were closed. When Steve and Christine moved in together, they found an old apartment in a nice neighborhood with white plaster walls all around. It was perfect for them, close to the university and their work, very spacious, and surprisingly affordable. Christine had loved the feel of it the moment she saw it, and Steve would have no complaints with how much friskier she was in this white apartment. Steve was careful to avoid any gray in the house. Each room was a different color to match its purpose. Their study desk was green and their kitchen was red. Their bedroom in particular was furnished in white, from the painted wardrobe to the white bed linen and the white carpet. Steve even took care with the lighting to avoid any shadows casting gray spots in the room. In their first week there, both had failed to attend any classes due to their extensive love-making sessions. It was after one of these particularly passionate sessions, while Steve lay asleep on the bed, that Christine noticed a faint crack in the opposite wall. Against the stark white plaster, the thin gray lines seemed to whisper imperceptibly to her from across the room. While it annoyed her, she decided to deal with it tomorrow, as they had a lot of catching up with classes to do. She took her sleeping pills and drifted off to a dreamless slumber. For the next day, she had completely forgotten about the crack, until she was in bed again staring at it. It became like an itch she couldn't scratch. It became more noticeable because she knew it was there. It called and beckoned to her, whispering to her to get closer. The more she gazed at it, the wider and thicker the gray crack seemed to get. She nudged Steve, who reassured her she was imagining things. He assured her he would paint over the wall on the weekend if it bothered her that much. True to his word, Steve filled the hairline crack with plaster and painted over the wall twice. It didn't help. She could still hear the voice calling to her. Her strategy was to now avoid looking at the wall, to banish it by ignoring it. But in her mind, she could still see that crack, now the width of a thick pencil. She was sure that the last word she could hear repeatedly as she drifted to her medicated sleep was a ghostly, "I'm here," and "No more hiding." One night she decided she could ignore it no longer, and had to face it. As she stared at the crack that went across the entire wall, she gasped as a bony finger started to poke out from its center and started to explore. She watched in mute horror as a second skeletal finger reached out from the gap and started feeling around the edges. She screamed so loud that Steve fell off the bed as he woke and pulled off his sleeping mask. Christine pointed at the empty wall, crying with teary eyes about a skeleton crawling behind there. Steve could see nothing, but no amount of consoling would convince her to spend another night in that room. She ended up staying over at a friend's place overnight, and refused to go back to the apartment until the wall was knocked down to prove she wasn't crazy. While Steve was hesitant to lose their bond by destroying a perfectly good wall to chase some ghosts, he weighed that up against losing a great apartment and his girlfriend. With great reluctance, he laid down some plastic on the floor and smashed a crowbar against the wall as Christine watched. Where there used to be a covered-up hairline crack, there was now a gaping hole that Steve started tearing at with his hands. With a quarter of the wall ripped, both Steve and Christine were stunned to find a crouching human skeleton, stuffed against the cavities and covered in cobwebs. They called the police to report their gruesome discovery. After extensive questioning, they were cleared of being suspects, as the body had been there long before Steve and Christine were even born. In the decades past, the building had shady tenants and a very different neighborhood. A known crime hotspot, it was a slum area that had been slowly gentrified over the past few years, its history plastered and painted over until it was respectable. The skeleton was traced back to a missing persons case back from 1973. Reported as missing by her mother, the victim was a young prostitute with a petty criminal record, a profile the police back then devoted precious few resources or sympathy to follow up. The police thought it was likely she was raped, murdered and walled up by one of the previous occupants, a notorious gang member who himself was killed in 1982 in a fight over money. The skeletal remains were eventually given a proper burial next to her long-deceased mother, a long overdue reunion. Luckily for Steve, the apartment owner was also understanding enough to pay for the repairs to the wall given the circumstances. However, try as they might, the rest of their life couldn't return to normal for the couple. The ordeal gave Christine constant nightmares about skeletons breaking through the wall, despite the sleeping pills, nor would the voices stop tormenting her. She eventually had to turn to harder narcotics to find any release to escape from her reality. The pressures of completing a degree and caring for Christine's drug abuse put an unbearable strain on their relationship, and they broke off soon after. It was mentally too difficult for either of them to cope. Since then, Steve has been in and out of several relationships over the years. A few days ago, he decided to track down Christine again to get more details for this story. He ended up speaking with her parents. Christine continued to struggle with drug addiction for several years after their breakup. Chronically short of money, she was constantly on the move from place to place. Her last known location was a rundown motel, where she had skipped rent and left all her meager belongings behind. Her parents had tried to track her down, and even enlisted the help of a private investigator. Christine was eventually found a few months ago. The motel she had stayed at was being demolished to make way for new apartments. In her former room, behind a wall with a crack running across it, her skeletal remains were found, trapped between the dark gray concrete. Gurgles and Bugman. Posted by One T Think Straight. After my last experience, my parents reminded me of another story from my childhood. When you're 5, your mind lacks the experience to make informed judgments, or connect things which aren't obvious. Over the years, the details get fuzzy and forgotten. Speaking with my parents the other day, they cleared the cobwebs burying this story. I remember now much too clearly the story of Gurgles and Bugman. I just started kindergarten that year. Everyone's a friend when you're 5, so I had no shortage of classmates. But coming from a poor family, I didn't get to see much of them outside of school. My parents spent all their waking hours trying to make ends meet and didn't have time to ferry me from house to house. So I spent my early years mostly keeping to myself, playing with the random assortment of knick-knacks from the shelf in my room. Being short of money gave my family a habit of hoarding, so they hated to throw anything out. One particular item on the shelf was a small, old-fashioned TV set. A wooden veneer box about 2 feet wide by a foot tall, it had a curved glass screen that took up half the front panel. Beside the screen was a large chrome dial used to switch channels. At the top sat an antenna formed by 2 terribly twisted wires. When my boredom made me turn it on, I'd usually just get static and snow on that glowing black and white screen. I'd twist the heavy clicking dial hoping to pick up some local broadcasts. Mostly it would be some ghostly images and incoherent sound fragments. But one channel was always crystal clear. It was the Gurgles and Bugman show. Gurgles was a clown, but not a common one. He wore a thin black suit that draped his tall skinny body with a matching tie, and oversized novelty clown shoes to complete his distinctive outfit. His pupils were completely black like polished ebony marbles with no trace of white around them. Black face paint around those eyes, and across his cheeks and mouth, made him look like a manic, grinning skeleton. It was only the crazy crop of curly hair sprouting off the sides of his head that gave him a more human look. As much as Gurgles freaked me out, Bugman scared me more. He was short and round, like a hunchback dwarf, with a dark cape. He had prosthetics covering his eyes to make him look like a fly, and a mouth that was rotated 90 degrees and open from side to side. The show itself was like candid camera, with pranks played on unsuspecting people. It would always start with Gurgles and Bugman hidden away at someone's home. Gurgles would face the camera, staring at you, his bony finger touching his lips. When the unsuspecting star of the show came into view, a laugh track would begin to play. You would see them go about their nightly routines, oblivious to the conspiracy that Gurgles and Bugman had involved us in. We'd see them making dinner, or on the lounge watching TV with their family, or quietly doing their homework. Then watch as Gurgles and Bugman stole their pen, or moved their glass, or made things disappear behind their backs. The camera angles would change as Gurgles and Bugman shifted their hiding place from the dark corners of a room, to the cupboards, to the ceiling, or under the furniture, all the while looking back at you and winking. The closer they got, the louder and more laughter from the soundtrack. Eventually, when everyone went to sleep, a victim would be chosen for their prank. Waiting in the closet or under the bed, Once their victim fell asleep, Bugman would crawl out and gently climb in beside them. His jaw would open sideways, and out would come a sharp straw that he'd stick in the person's neck. This always paralyzed their victim, because sometimes you could see them struggle if they woke and saw Gurgles and Bugman on top of them. The laugh track would then be extra loud and uproarious those few times the victims awoke. Gurgles would make faces at the camera while the audience laughed, and Bugman would use his straw to drink from the person's neck. When the victim stopped struggling after a few minutes, and the laughter would turn to claps and cheering. With Bugman finished, Gurgle's face would fill the whole screen with his impossibly wide, sharp-toothed grin. Then he'd whisper, "See you again, son." The way those all-black eyes pierced through the screen always gave me the chills. I hated the show, but would be always too afraid to go near the TV while it was running. One day, the TV mysteriously disappeared from my room. My parents told my 5-year-old self that they sold it to pay some bills. I accepted that without question. I was kinda glad it was gone. But yesterday, when I asked them about that TV again, they exchanged nervous glances, then filled in some missing gaps from my childhood. Halfway through that year, Derek, a classmate I didn't know very well, had died in horrific circumstances. He was murdered in his bed with a stab wound to the neck. No evidence of a break-in was ever found, so his distraught parents were taken into custody as the primary suspects. They denied all the allegations against them. At the time, Mrs. Nolan, my teacher, told our class, I'd apparently explained to her that Derek couldn't be dead because I saw him and his family on the Gurgles and Bugman show the day before. When Mrs. Nolan mentioned to my parents what I'd said, they had immediately taken the TV from my room, driven it to a junkyard, and had it burned to nothing but ashes and molten metal. That TV was in my room because it had always been broken. It was never plugged in the whole time it sat on my shelf. Whatever I saw on that screen, it wasn't from a station. So that's my story of Gurgles and Bugman. But I'm not sure if that's really the end though. After all, do Gurgles and Bugman still perform their nightly show for some unsuspecting viewer, somewhere in this world? And if so, who will be their next star? A curious mind is a terrible curse. Posted by Won't Think Straight. A curious mind is a terrible curse. That's the way it's always been for me. Some of my earliest memories are of secretly listening to my dad swapping ghost stories with his buddies while I sat wrapped in the room next door. I can't help it, I have a yearning to know the great unknown. In some macabre way, I've always wanted to experience something paranormal for myself, just so I can know the truth. Over time, I never did encounter anything that reason and logic could not explain. The adult world was ultimately very rational. The childhood wonder and possibilities dissolves quickly into the reality of serious jobs and mortgages. But all that changed recently. The house I grew up in was a small wooden building in the middle of suburbia. It was without question the oldest house in the street, which was how we could afford to live in it. I'd always wondered if it was haunted. Anything that old must have had some dark history to it. But it was always uneventful. There was some constant the scratching noises above my bedroom at night, but it turned out to be just pigeons roosting in the ceiling. Once when I was 10, I was playing alone on the floor of my bedroom. My heart suddenly froze when I could distinctly hear the sound of snoring coming from my bed. I could hear the sound growing louder and louder. I stared at my bed, but saw nothing there. Mustering what little courage I had, I yelled out, "Hello? Who is there?" All I got back was a loud, horrible snore. I grabbed an umbrella and gingerly walked towards my bed, heart pounding furiously. There wasn't anything moving as I poked my blanket and pillow. It was then I noticed the window above the bed was slightly open. The moment I closed it, the snoring stopped. It was nothing more than the wind whispering through the cracks. Another experience was the nightly terrors that would strike me in my sleep. I would often awake to the sensation of my blanket being ripped away and my body held down, while a dark, angry entity strangled my throat so hard that the bed would rattle. The first time, I thought it was just a vivid, but terrible nightmare. But when it happened again and again, night after night, I started to panic. Whatever it was relentless. As I seemed to always survive each attack though I was just going crazy. Thankfully, I learned about sleep paralysis a few months later. Changing my sleeping pattern stopped it from happening again. So everything paranormal that I've ever experienced was ultimately very rational. Like the famous poster in Fox Mulder's office. I want to believe, but ultimately found the evidence lacking. But I can found no explanation for what's happened to me recently. I had decided to take a break and spend a few weeks backpacking in Vietnam. Starting from Ho Chi Minh City, we took a winding journey northwards through the muddy roads along the coast. It was miles and miles of mostly untouched wilderness broken by the occasional village, and some of the best pristine beaches in the world. It was in one particular stretch that we spent a full day soaking in the sun and surf, the worries of the world 1,000 miles away. As day made way to twilight, we feasted on some amazing seafood we had caught earlier. Sleeping under an open sky is an amazing experience, especially far away from the polluting lights of civilization. It was to this glorious view of the heavens that I awoke around 3 a.m., feeling the less glorious call of nature urging me to the nearest toilet. It was a humid night with the sound of insects chirping their nightly symphony. I groggily made my way through the path to the basic facilities set up for campers. It was in a clearing with male toilets lined along one side of a 30-foot wide crude concrete floor, facing another row of female toilets. Between the rows in the center was a waiting area, with a makeshift lamp hanging above to light the yard. As I approached, I saw an old man standing under the lamp with his back towards me. All I could see was his scraggy long white hair that reached past his shoulders, and a thin old bony body jutting up from his thin clothing rags. Slightly freaked out, I wasn't expecting anyone to be around at this time of night. I coughed politely to make him aware of my approach. I didn't want an old man's heart attack from fright weighing on my conscience. He was probably a local villager waiting on his wife, since electricity and running water was scarce in the scattered collection of homes in the area. He didn't seem to notice me, so I let him be and made my way to the nearest male stall. As I closed the door, I could still see him in my line of sight. Though I was now 90 degrees from where I first saw him, he still had his back to me again. It was definitely odd, but certainly far from threatening. Besides, I had more urgent pressing matters, particularly against my bowels. The toilet was barely more than a hole in the floor, with a flimsy undersized door that was all that stood between you and your dignity. The overwhelming stench of human waste filled my senses as I dropped my pants and squatted to make my own deposit. After a few moments, my thoughts lazily drifted back to the old man in the yard. There was something definitely odd, and my subconscious was screaming that something was very out of place. With rapidly rising horror, my mind clicked the pieces into place. Though the old man was standing near a bright light, he didn't cast a shadow. The possibility it could have been an optical illusion vanished when I suddenly saw his shadowless feet inches away through the gaps under the toilet door. I was almost thankful I was squatting with my pants down, since I emptied my bowels simultaneously with my lungs emptying a scream through the other end. I jumped up and pulled my pants up as I backed up to the back wall. From my now standing position, I had lost sight of what was under the door. With no shadow, I could not tell if it was still waiting there. My mind furiously ran through what scarce options I had. I realized I didn't have much of a choice but to escape this stall. This flimsy door would provide no protection for me, and there was certainly nothing left of my dignity. If I was to die, I decided it wouldn't be in this little shithole. I peeked under the door, but couldn't see anything on the other side. Deciding it was now or never, I kicked open the door, to nothing but an empty courtyard. I rushed out but could see no sign of the old man. Nothing but the incessant sound of crickets. It was then I made the fatal mistake of looking at the stall I had just escaped from. He was there, that dreaded white-haired and bony body, standing where I was mere seconds ago. For the second time that night I was thankful, as I had nothing left to brown my pants as I let out another scream. Now, running on pure instinct, I sprinted back to the beach like I was being chased by demons. For all I knew, I actually was. Making it back to the camp, I spent the next few hours wide awake. Crouching and staring at the trail, I was ready to wake everyone at the merest sign of the old man. When morning finally broke, my campmates lazily woke and wondering why I looked like death itself. I was too afraid to tell them what I saw, and simply explained that I was struck with insomnia that night. Nothing as eventful happened for the remainder of the trip, but I had to share my experience with our local tour guide on the last day. I had to know the truth. When I finished my story, he only looked gravely at me and asked just one question. "Did you see its face?" He explained that in Vietnam, lonely ghosts often haunt sites where travelers can be found. Those who see their face are doomed to a grisly, gruesome death in the near future. It's been almost 2 months since that fateful encounter. To this day, I still don't know if I really saw its face. It's a blur that still haunts me, and I'm not sure I want to know. Maybe there are some things in life that are better left unknown. I think I am already cursed enough. A package marked, "Return to sender." Posted by Manon Lysette. My neighbor is one of those annoying wannabe YouTube personalities. Over the years, I've seen him cough out cinnamon, lay flat on the hood of his car as it slowly creeps down the driveway, and douse himself in lukewarm water, all the while screaming epic win, epic fail, or fuck, epic maintenance of the status quo, for all I know. It can get tiring to watch him go about his shenanigans in the pursuit of viral fame. So, when he knocked on my door the other day, told me he was going away for a few weeks, and asked that I get his mail, honestly, it was a relief. I can't explain the peace of mind I had knowing I didn't have to brace myself for any of his stupidity for a while. I was always afraid his stunts would wind up bleeding over into my life. Things were pretty normal for the first couple of days. He received a few bills, a bit of spam, and what I could only assume was a birthday card. Then, one evening, I got home to find a cardboard box waiting on his front porch. In big red letters was written, "Return to sender." I'm no small fry, but I admit I had trouble lifting the box on my own. It was really freaking heavy. Lugging it across the road to my house was even harder, and I quickly realized there was no way I was going to drag it up the stairs and through my front door. I decided I'd leave his package in my garage. It wasn't like I kept my car in there. The garage door was a piece of shit that refused to open without a good thug and a whack. It was less trouble just leaving the car in the driveway than it was to fight with the garage door every morning and night. In hindsight, I should have set the package down while I struggled to open the tricky door. But you know how it is when you've got a good grip on something, no point in setting it down if you don't have to. It was as I kicked the door for a third time that I lost my grip on the package, and it fell to the ground. I heard a light crack inside. "Shit," I cursed. I hoped I hadn't broken anything important, but figured I just wouldn't tell my neighbor about it and let him assume the break happened en route. Hands free, I finally managed to get the garage door unstuck, and boy did it screech in protest as it rolled up and over me. I dragged the box the rest of the way, setting it in the corner for whenever my neighbor would come back to claim it. And then, I forgot all about it. Until a few days passed, that is. I'm not sure exactly how long it took for the smell to waft in from the crack under the garage-to-house door, but it came in slow progression. It was a sickly sweet odor similar to a skunk, and for the first few days after I smelled it, I genuinely assumed that's exactly what it was, roadkill that had left its mark on my house. It was only when I realized the scent was growing more intense instead of fading that I went looking for a source. That's when I opened the garage door, and that's when the odor knocked me back, holding my nose. The culprit wasn't hard to identify. The only change in my garage was the box in the corner. I remember thinking it must have been one of those meat of the month subscription boxes. The meat must have gone rancid from being left out of the fridge for so long. How much meat could have been in there for the box to have been so large and heavy? An entire freaking cow? I covered my nose as I approached the box, a pair of scissors in my hands. I probably wouldn't have needed them to open it, as it had become soggy enough at the bottom to poke through with a finger, but I wasn't about to poke my finger into spoiled meat juices. That soggy bottom was the reason I had to open the box in the first place. If I tried to drag it out whole, everything would spill onto the floor. I was going to have to dump the pieces of meat one garbage bag at a time, and take them down to the dumpster, a process I wasn't looking forward to. My scissors tore through the tape along the top of the cardboard box. I thought the smell couldn't get any worse, but as I flipped the flaps open, I discovered a whole new gamut of stink. It was like opening a burning oven, but instead of a heat wave, I was met with waves of piss, sweat, shit, and putrefaction. It was so bad that I staggered back and had to force down the puke begging to guzzle out of me. I don't think I could have handled that scent mingling with the horrors coming out of the box. I'm not ashamed to admit I ran out the door for a breath of fresh air, but in the short time I'd spent in the garage, the smell had become so ingrained in the fabric of my clothes that it clung to me like a shadow. Nothing I tried could keep the smell out of my nostrils. Not air fresheners, not a face mask, not 3 showers and a change of clothes. Every second that box lay open in my garage was another second the smell was allowed a foothold into my home. I had to bite the bullet. I returned to the garage, the flaps of the box still open as though inviting me to look. I was prepared, a clothespin pinning my nostrils shut, a garbage bag in one hand, the strongest cleaner I could find in the other, and long rubber gloves to keep my skin from having to touch what was inside. But as it turns out, I needed none of those things. I wouldn't have to touch or clean the contents of that box. I would only have to suffer the nightmares every night. You see, there was meat in that box, but it didn't come from a cow or a pig. No, it was worse than that. It was my neighbor. Dead. Still in one piece, but dead. I called the cops, and naturally, they took me in for interrogation. It's kind of hard not to suspect the man with a corpse in his garage, after all. Thankfully, they soon realized I wasn't involved. My DNA might have been all over that box, the smell might have left a mark throughout my house, but there was one piece of irrefutable evidence in my neighbor's own hands that proved my innocence: a vlogging camera. They showed me the footage only once. I'm not sure if they were allowed to, or if they felt so bad for me they figured it couldn't hurt. Either way, I saw it. My neighbor was sitting in the box outside of a shipping facility, laughing as he told the world how he was going to mail himself across state lines. He'd brought pee bottles, food, a pillow, and a few flashlights. His friend, a guy I'd seen at his place several times to help with his stunts, closed the lid and presumably dropped him off for shipment. Throughout the next couple of hours, or days, I'm honestly not sure, my neighbor recorded a few short clips about his progress. I think I'm in a truck now. I can feel it moving, must be in a warehouse. Pretty warm here. Still got plenty of food, that kind of stuff. And then, on the last entry, the box toppled over. He broke his neck, and that was it. The camera recorded until either the memory card got too full, or the battery died. There's one thing I didn't tell the police after they showed me the video. One thing I heard in the footage that will haunt me to the day I die. Just after the tumble that broke his neck, I heard the familiar screeching sound of my garage door. An email from my daughter's killer. Posted by Double Door Bastard. Do you believe in coincidences? Seems like a funny question, doesn't it? I've never paid it much thought before now either. Perhaps I have some explaining to do. As of yesterday, it's been a year since my daughter went missing. There was never any ransom note, no remains discovered, and not an iota of evidence to support the standard theories of foul play and kidnapping. Aside from her absence itself, the whole situation seemed freakishly clean. At only 14 years old, she'd gone missing without a trace. Her name was Emily. I can say that dreaded was, with confidence now. It's a bitter blessing, one that's come at great cost to all of us. When Emily disappeared, she left myself, her father, and her older brother, Joseph, in a state of perpetual anxiety. The limbo of monstrous uncertainty. Every phone call was a needle pressed into our skin, and every newscast that aired about that poor girl, still missing, presumed dead, felt like having boiling water poured down our throats. Not knowing, that's the real torture. Until yesterday, I truly believed that. Until yesterday, when I got an email from an unknown source. An email claiming to have the truth of what happened to Emily on that terrible day. The following is the contents of that email. From msasri1234@gmail.com. Subject: an apology for what I've done. Hello, Mrs. Stanfield. I won't tell you my name. That's not important right now. What's important is what I've done, and how sorry I am for doing it. I'll be quick and honest. Emily is dead, and I killed her. I would love to tell you it was quick and merciful, but it was neither. She died slowly and terribly. I can't imagine that my initial enjoyment of that fact will serve as any kind of consolation. I've loved Emily for a very long time, in what you might call an improper way. The hardest part was knowing she could never love me back, at least not in the way I loved her, though this wasn't for lack of trying, though. I'd made passes before, just silly attempts really, but she was never receptive to my affection. She was disgusted by me, and that made me feel small and angry. Though I can be thankful of the fact that she never told you about any of it. I guess it would have been terribly embarrassing for her if you knew. Not that she'll care now. Do you know how hard it is to cope with fantasy, Mrs. Stanfield? I've had such ugly dreams about Emily, and I know that they're ugly, but I still can't help but find them so exciting. I've wondered many times over the past year whether it was the ugliness of it all that made me so passionate. When all you've got is a fantasy that you think is unattainable, you spend lots of time refining it, like a sculptor chipping away at a statue, hoping to find perfection hidden in the granite. It doesn't matter how many times you secretly loosen the valves with your hands, that just keeps the fantasy down. It doesn't destroy it, can't destroy it. It just gains another component. Maybe it's another 15 minutes of torture, another scream. Maybe it's a different tool added to the kit. By the time the fantasy comes to boil, it's too complex to be satisfying on the basis of thought alone. You have to make it into flesh. Warm, satisfying flesh. And I did, Mrs. Stanfield, I really did. I have to be honest with you, it wasn't so much about wanting to live my fantasy, as it was about wanting to know whether I had it in me to carry it out. There was no dignity in pleasuring myself to the thoughts of violence, only in being able to say that I had the courage to do the one thing that had been giving my life any sort of meaning. And a year ago today, I proved that I did have that courage. My little indiscretions were in the past. I was patient, like a crocodile. I played the long game. I got Emily to trust me again with time. I let her be comfortable around me, let her drop her guard. She was on her way home from school when I finally took a chance and made my move. I picked out an old, beat-up shack in the woods in advance. I threw down a woolen tarp and prepared some shackles. I even lit a few candles for romantic effect. More for myself than her, admittedly. Emily was apprehensive at first, but I managed to talk her into visiting the little cabin with me. The door was shut and bolted behind us before she ever even saw the gun I was holding, but when she did, she was a good girl and didn't scream. Though I must say, I was a little disappointed at that. I'm not a pornographer, so I won't be lured with the details of what I did. I'm aware that it's perverse, but the wind outside hardly matters when you're a hurricane. My whole life was perversity, hidden and locked away. Emily was the outlet for that perversity. Part of me thinks I only ever loved her because she was convenient, because she was accessible. I used a hammer, a knife, a pair of pliers, and a power drill. It all got messier than I expected, so much blood, so much other things. All in all, it took a few hours before she finally died, which was admirable. She never did let me have my fun. Emily was such a strong girl. You should be proud of her, Mrs. Stanfield. For my own pride, I'd like to state that I didn't fuck her before she died. I couldn't bring myself to cross that barrier, knowing her eyes would be on me while it was happening. The thought of it disgusted me. She died, to the best of my knowledge, a virgin. Once I was fully done with her, and the euphoria of it all had passed, it dawned on me what a terrible thing I'd done. My pleasure turned to disgust, and all the sweetness that was inside of me while I was killing her turned sour. I realized that I was not meant to be a murderer, that it didn't suit me, that beyond the temporary pleasure of the act the thought of taking someone's life repulsed me. I was a fantasist who made a terrible, terrible mistake, one that cost the life of a promising young girl. If there is a grand plan out there that we're all a part of, I could feel that what I had done was a deviation from that natural law. I was disgusted at the act, and at myself. This little experiment had backfired on me entirely. I was so out of my depth. Once I'd gotten over the initial wave of fear and panic, I cut up Emily's body into smaller pieces that were easier to carry. I took all the pieces, wrapped them up in the woolen tarp, and burned them with lighter fluid in the woods. After that, I buried the bundle of charred bones in ashes, wishing I could have just forgotten all of it. Killing Emily and doing the things I did to her body were not acts of courage. I've realized that over the past year. They were acts of obsession and cowardice, of a person not strong enough to overcome their darker urges. I've been racked by guilt, surrounded by reminders of the life I've taken and can never give back. That's why I've decided to do the courteous thing and let you know that I've decided to take another life, mine. All I can ever be is a danger to the people around me, a time bomb destined to blow up and hurt another innocent. The only altruistic thing for a person in my position to do is take myself out of the picture. I'm sorry for what I did to Emily. I don't expect for you to forgive me, nor do I think I deserve it. I just hope this gives you some sense of closure and allows you to move on. My sincerest apologies. After I read that terrible email, I cried for hours. I didn't have that violent reaction because I believed I'd been contacted by my daughter's killer, but just because I felt like someone was playing a horrific joke on my family after we'd been through so much. And on the anniversary of our Emily's disappearance, no less. I didn't show my husband, or my son. I couldn't bear to. I just bore the cross myself, and wore a brave face for them, knowing the anniversary was hard on all of us. I wouldn't let the monster on the other end of that email tear up my family. But this morning, I heard two almighty bangs ring out from Joseph's bedroom. By the time his father and I had forced open the door, it was too late. He'd somehow gotten his hands on a gun and fired 2 shots, one through his laptop and another through his forehead. So, with this in mind, I'll ask you all again, do you believe in coincidences? Balloons. Posted by 1000 Vultures. When I was 5 years old, I went to an elementary school that, from what I've come to understand, was really adamant about the importance of learning through activity. It was part of a new program designed to allow children to rise at their own pace, and to facilitate this, the school encouraged teachers to come up with really inventive lesson plans. Each teacher was given the latitude to create his or her own themes which would run for the duration of the grade, and all the lessons in math, reading, etc., would be designed in the spirit of the theme. These themes were called groups. There was a space group, a sea group, an earth group, and the group I was in. Community. In kindergarten in this country you don't learn much except how to tie your shoes and how to share, so most of it isn't very memorable. I only remember two things very clearly. I was the best at writing my name the right way, and the balloon project, which was really the hallmark of the community group, since it was a pretty clever way to show how a community functioned at a really basic level. You've probably heard of this activity. On one Friday, I remember it being Friday because I was excited about the project, and it being the end of the week, toward the beginning of the year, we walked into the classroom in the morning and saw that there was a fully inflated balloon tied off with string taped to each of our desks. Sitting on each of our desks was a marker, a pen, a piece of paper, and an envelope. The project was to write a note on the paper, put it in the envelope, and attach it to the balloon, which we could draw a picture on if we wanted. Most of the kids started fighting over the balloons because they wanted different colors, but I started on my note, which I had thought a lot about. All the notes had to follow a loose structure, but we were allowed to be creative within those boundaries. My note was something like this. Hi! You found my balloon! My name is Name, and I attend elementary school. You can keep the balloon, but I hope you write me back. I like Mighty Max, exploring, building forts, swimming, and friends. What do you like? Write me back soon. Here's $1 for the mail. On the dollar I wrote, for stamps, right across the front, which my mom said was unnecessary, but I thought it was genius, so I did it. The teacher took a Polaroid of each of us with our balloons and had us put them in the envelope along with our letter. They also included another letter that I assume explained the nature of the project and sincere appreciation for anyone's participation in writing back and sending photos of their city or neighborhood. That was the whole idea, to build a sense of community without having to leave the school, and to establish safe contact with other people. It seemed like such a fun idea. Over the next couple weeks the letters started to roll in. Most came with pictures of different landmarks, and each time a letter would come in the teacher would pin the picture on a big wall map we had put up showing where the letter had come from and how far the balloon had traveled. It was a really smart idea, because we actually looked forward to coming to school to see if we had gotten our letter. For the duration of the year we had one day a week where we could write back to our pen pal or another student's pen pal in case our letter hadn't come in yet. Mine was one of the last to arrive. When I came into the classroom I looked at my desk and once again didn't see any letter waiting for me, but as I sat down the teacher approached me and handed me an envelope. I must have looked so excited because as I was about to open it she put her hand on mine to stop me and said, "Please don't be upset." I didn't understand what she meant. Why would I be upset now that my letter had come? Initially I was mystified that she would even know what was in the envelope. But now I realized that of course the teachers had screened the contents to make sure there was nothing obscene, but all the same, how could I be disappointed? When I opened the envelope I understood. There was no letter. The only thing in the envelope was a Polaroid, but I couldn't really make out what it was. It looked like a patch of desert, but it was too blurry to decipher. It appeared as if the camera had been moved while the picture was being taken. There was no return address, so I couldn't even write back if I wanted to. I was crushed. The school year pressed on, and the letters had stopped coming for nearly all of the other students. After all, you can only continue a written correspondence with a kindergartner for so long. Everyone, including myself, had lost interest in the letters almost completely. Then I got another envelope. My excitement was rejuvenated, and I reveled in the fact that I was still getting a letter when most of the other pen pals had abandoned their involvement. It made sense that I received another delivery. There had been nothing but a blurry picture in the first one, so this was probably to make up for that. But again there was no letter at all, just another picture. This one was more distinguishable, but I still didn't understand it. The photograph was angled way up, catching the top corner of a building, and the rest of the image was distorted by a lens flare from the sun. Because the balloons didn't travel very far, and because they were all launched on the same day, the board became a bit cluttered, and so the policy for the students still exchanging letters became that they could take the photographs home. My best friend Josh had the second highest number of pictures taken home by the end of the year. His pen pal was really cooperative and sent him pictures from all around the neighboring city. Josh took home, I think, 4 pictures. I took home nearly 50. The envelopes were all opened by the teacher, but after a while I stopped even looking at the pictures. However, I saved them in one of my drawers that housed my collections of rocks, baseball cards, comic book cards, Marvel metal cards, for those who might remember, and little miniature baseball batting helmets that I'd get out of a vending machine at Winn-Dixie after T-ball games. With the school year over, my attention turned to other things. My mom had gotten me a small snow cone machine for Christmas that year, and Josh had really coveted it. So much so that his parents bought him a slightly nicer one for his birthday, which was toward the end of the school year. That summer we had the idea that we would set up a snow cone stand to make money. We thought we'd make a fortune selling snow cones at $1. Josh lived in a different neighborhood, but we eventually decided that my neighborhood would be better because there were a lot of people who cared for their lawns. The yards in my neighborhood were slightly bigger. We did this for 5 weekends in a row until my mom told us that we had to stop, and I've only recently come to understand why she did that. On the 5th weekend, Josh and I were counting our money. Because we both had a machine, we each had a separate stack of money that we put together into one stack, and we then split it evenly. We had made a total of $16 that day, and as Josh paid out my $5th, a feeling of profound surprise consumed me. The dollar said, "For stamps." Josh noticed my shock and asked if he had miscounted. I told him about the dollar, and he said, "That's so cool, man." As I thought about it, I came to agree. The idea that the dollar had made it right back to me after changing so many hands floored me. I rushed inside to tell my mom, but my excitement coupled with her being distracted by a phone call made my story incomprehensible, and she responded simply by saying, "Oh wow! That's neat!" Frustrated, I ran back outside and told Josh I had something to show him. Back in my room, I opened the drawer and took out the stack of envelopes and showed him some of the pictures. I started with the first picture, and we went through about 10 before Josh lost interest and asked if I wanted to go play in the ditch, a dirt ditch down the street from my house, before his mom came to pick him up, so that's what we did. We had a dirt war for a while, but it was interrupted several times by rustling in the woods around us. There were raccoons and stray cats that lived in there, but this was making a little too much noise, and we traded guesses at what it was in an attempt to scare each other. My last guess was that it was a mummy, but in the end Josh kept insisting that it was a robot because of the sounds that we heard. Before we left, he got a little serious and looked me right in the eyes and said, "You heard it, didn't you? It sounded like a robot. You heard it too, right?" I had heard it, and since it sounded mechanical, I agreed that it was probably a robot. It's only now that I understand what we heard. When we got back, Josh's mom was waiting for him at the kitchen table with my mom. Josh told his mom about the robot, our moms laughed, and Josh went home. My mom and I ate dinner, and then I went to bed. I didn't stay in bed for long before I crept out and decided that, due to the day's events, I would revisit the envelopes since now the whole affair seemed much more interesting. I took the first envelope and set it on the floor and set the blurry desert Polaroid on top. I laid the second envelope right next to it and placed the oddly angled Polaroid of a building's top corner on top, and did this with each picture until they formed a grid that was about 5 by 10. I was always taught to be careful with things that I was collecting, even if I wasn't sure they were valuable. I noticed that the pictures gradually became more decipherable. There was a tree with a bird on it, a speed limit sign, power line, a group of people walking into some building. And then I saw something that vexed me so powerfully that I can now, as I write this, distinctly remember feeling dizzy and capable of only a single, repeating thought. Why am I in this picture? In this photograph of the group of people entering the building, I saw myself holding hands with my mother in the very back of the crowd of people. We were at the very edge of the photo, but it was undeniably us. and as my eyes swam over the sea of Polaroids I became increasingly anxious. It was a really odd feeling. It wasn't fear, it was the feeling you get when you are in trouble. I'm not sure why I was flooded with that feeling, but there I sat floundering in the distinct sense that I had done something wrong. And this feeling only intensified as I looked on at the rest of the photos after that, the one that had so powerfully struck me. I was in every photo. None of them were close shots. None of them were only of me. But I was in every single one of them, off to the side, in the back, bottom of the frame. Some of them only had the tiniest part of my face captured at the very edge of the photo, but nevertheless, I was there. I was always there. I didn't know what to do. Your mind works in funny ways as a kid, but there was a large part of me that was afraid of getting in trouble simply for still being up. Since I already had the looming feeling of having done something wrong, I decided that I would wait until tomorrow. The next day, my mom was off work and spent most of the morning cleaning up around the house. I watched cartoons, I imagine, and waited until I thought it was a good time to show her the Polaroids. When she went out to get the mail, I grabbed a couple of the pictures and put them on the table in front of me as I sat waiting for her to come back in. When returned, she was already opening the mail and threw some junk mail into the trash can, and I said, "Mom, can you come here for a second? I have these pictures. Just give me a minute, honey. I need to mark these on the calendar." After a minute or two, she came and stood behind me and asked me what I needed. I could hear her shuffling with the mail behind me, but I just looked at the Polaroids and told her about them. As I explained more and pointed to the pictures, her frequent "hus" and "okays" decreased, and she was suddenly completely quiet and only making a little noise with the mail. The next noise I heard from her sounded as if she was trying to catch her breath in a room that had no air left in it. At last her struggling gasps were conquered, and she simply dropped the remaining mail on the table and ran to the kitchen to get the phone. "Mom! I'm sorry, I didn't know about these. Don't be mad at me." With the phone pressed to her ear, she was walking/running back and forth and shouting into it. I nervously fiddled with the mail sitting next to my Polaroids. The top envelope had something sticking out of it that I thoughtlessly and anxiously pulled on until it came out. It was another Polaroid. Confused, I thought that somehow one of my Polaroids had slipped into the stack when she threw the mail down, but when I turned it over and looked at it, I realized that I had not seen this one before. To my dismay, it was me, but this one was a much closer shot. I was surrounded by trees and was smiling. But it wasn't just me, I noticed. Josh was there too. This was us from yesterday. I started yelling for my mom, who was still screaming into the phone. I repeated the yell for her until she finally responded with, "What?" And I could only think to ask, "Who are you calling?" "I'm talking with the police, honey." "But why?" "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to do anything." She answered me with a response that I never understood until I was forced to revisit these events from the earliest years of my life. She grabbed the envelope off the table, and the picture of Josh and I spun and slid, landing next to the other Polaroids in front of me. She held the envelope up to my eyes, but I could only look at her and watch as all the color began draining out of her face. With tears welling up in her eyes, she said that she had to call the police because there was no postmark. Betsy the Doll. Posted by the Dalek Emperor. Like most people these days, I had a fucked up childhood. Who doesn't, right? My father took off before I was born, and my mother was left to care for me on her own, a skill she was sorely lacking. My mother slipped right back into the drug-addled, party lifestyle she'd enjoyed before I was born, and had soon turned our two-bedroom apartment into an opium den. For the first 5 years of my life, I walked around in a confused, terrifying mist. The smoky air would flood down the hallway from our living room and slip under my bedroom door. It always seemed to linger for days. I know now that my mother wasn't a bad person, just a victim of her addictions. When she did have spare money, she would put food in the house or buy me clothes from Goodwill. The only pieces of furniture I had in my bedroom was a mattress set and a little blue and white toy chest. Not that I had a lot of toys to put in it, of course, just the 3 I had gotten for birthdays. One was an art kit, one was a red wagon, and the last, my pride and joy, was a doll named Betsy. Betsy was my best friend. We would have imaginary tea parties together, sleep together, and even take baths together. Sometimes, I even remember her voice. When I thought back on my conversations with the doll in adulthood, I realized that I was likely suffering from delusions, thanks to the always-present butts of smoke that laid claim to the dingy hallways and drafty bedrooms of our small apartment. Still, I remember the sound of her voice, a pleasant, tingling lilt that was almost always coupled with a raucous giggle. I also remember the things that she said to me and the things she wanted me to do. She asked me to steal usual food or pens and pencils. She wanted me to bring her forks and knives and hit the bad man who slept on our couch. It was always something and I would always get in trouble. But she wouldn't. When I told my mother who had put me up to these games, she would scoff and shake her head. She never believed me. Adults never do. Around my 6th birthday, I asked my mother for a birthday party. I wanted to invite the mean girls from school and serve them cake and ice cream to make them like me. I remember standing in the kitchen that day with such hopes, having just asked the most important question of my entire life. The glass bottle of Coca-Cola I held was shaking in my nervous hands. I waited with bated breath as my mother continued putting groceries away, almost as if she hadn't heard me. But I knew she had. Finally, just as I had failed a second time to muster the courage to repeat my question, she turned around and gave me a flippant shake of her head. "A birthday party? Laura, that's ridiculous. I can't afford to feed 15 children that aren't even mine. Hell, I can barely afford to feed you. You eat like an elephant, especially for a girl your size. Or, I'm sorry, Betsy does. There's barely anything left for me to eat around here, much less a classroom of other people's brats." My face fell as she shook her head, mumbled something else under her breath, and stumbled off into the living room. I heard the music go up then as more people walked in the door. Some left, some stayed. I never knew them either way. It simply wasn't fair. My mother threw parties all the time. What about me? I was a kid. All my friends had birthday parties, and now the mean girls at school would know I was too poor to have one, and they would tease me even more. I felt tears start to well in the corners of my eyes, and I choked back a sob while I ran to my room and slammed the door behind me. Betsy was lying on the bed and smiling. She was always smiling. Usually it made me feel better, but today it just made me angry. She just kept staring at me, smiling. She was going to tell me to do something bad again. This was why Mother wouldn't throw me a birthday party. It was because of all the trouble I got into because of her. This was her fault. Betsy didn't have to go to school, and Betsy never got in trouble like I did. And in my young mind, I truly believed it was the doll, not my mother, who was to blame for everything. I snapped then. I screamed in indignant rage, and I threw the bottle as hard as I could at the bed. It hit Betsy on her forehead and she fell on the floor. Good. I picked up the bottle and I hit her again and again. I thought I heard her laugh and I hit her harder. Then I laughed. When my rage was spent, I dragged Betsy to my toy chest and threw her in. I slammed it shut and kicked the chest against the wall. I never wanted to see Betsy again ever. I never owned another doll after Betsy. About a week later the police came and 2 nice ladies took me to live in a new home in a new state, with food and toys and no drugs. The trunk went into storage and the wagon disappeared. I never saw my mother again. As I got older, my foster parents admitted she was in jail, doing 25 years. That was fine with me. I felt nothing for her anyway. I still had nightmares because of my life with that woman. But then slowly, I began to heal. I focused on doing well in school and I ignored my mother's letters from prison. She reached out to me several times in my 20s, as well, but I always declined her calls. That is, until this morning. I'm 30 now, with my own children and a loving, honest husband. I have a beautiful house, 2 dogs and a career as a social worker trying to make a difference for kids who had it bad like me. I'm happy, I'm steady, and I'm content. So when I got a voicemail from my mother informing me she had been paroled and that she wished to speak, decided to let her say her piece. Since the kids were home from school, I went out into our shed in the backyard to return my mother's call. The shed was the children's domain, and they used it to play in the summer. I sat on my old toy chest, which was currently being used as tea party table, and dialed the number she had left me. 3 rings. Hello? Laura? Hello, Mother. How are you? Oh, Laura, thank you for speaking to me. I know you have your own life now and a family. I would love to meet them someday. I just wanted to tell you how sorry I am. For everything. Mother, you are not meeting my kids ever. And since you called me, I am going to what I have needed to say for years. The opium, the heroin, they destroyed you. And the worst of it is that you almost took me down with you. I was 5. That was no home for a child. Honestly, I'm surprised it took you so long to get caught. Laura, I know how it seems, but I honestly know nothing. Look, it hardly matters, and I do understand why you would feel that way. Why you would hate me and not want me to meet your little ones. I learned a lot about forgiveness while I was away, and oh Laura, I am so sorry about Betsy. Betsy? I paused, confused. Why would you care about her? I know, Laura, believe me, I do. It was all my fault, the drugs, the partying. And Betsy, oh God, if I had only paid attention, if I had only known. She's gone, and it's because of me. As my mother began to cry, I tapped my fingers on the toy box, impatiently. The drugs had clearly fried her brain. Mother, I sighed. Why are you talking about Betsy? And why do you even care? I know where Betsy is. Right underneath me. What are you talking about, Laura? Oh God, where is she? I shifted uncomfortably. Well, Betsy's in the trunk, where she's always been. There was a beat of stunning silence. What do you mean your sister's in the trunk? Sister? What the hell are you talking about? Back on drugs so soon? That's a record even for you. Betsy is a goddamn doll. I locked her in my toy box a few days before you got arrested for possession. Laura. Oh God, no. No. Laura, what have you done? I wasn't arrested because of the drugs, Laura. I was arrested because of Betsy's disappearance. You always called her your little doll, but we thought you knew. Oh God. We thought you knew. Laura, no, what have you done to my baby? My mind had gone blank, and with no emotion I set the phone down next to me and stood up. I could hear the muffled sound of my mother's anguished cries and feel the dark clutch of possibility in my own chest. Memories were stirring in the back of my mind, threatening to flood forward into my consciousness. They pushed against a door in my mind that had been locked so tightly for so long that I had forgotten it was even there. Was it even possible? Could the trauma and the opium have really led me to believe that a small child was actually dull? Begging for food and utensils to eat with, asking me to protect her from the bad man? No. I slowly turned around and brought my eyes down the makeshift tea party table. Surely it was too small. You couldn't fit a person in there. You couldn't. But then, what about a very small, starving, emaciated child? What about her? Would she fit? Would an investigator even bother looking for a person in this chest? I knew I wouldn't. It was just too small. And I was sure we had opened the toy box at some point over the years, hadn't we? Or had something swimming in the dark recesses of my memories always stopped me? I couldn't remember ever seeing it open. I knelt down to the ground and opened the clasps. It would be better to not look. After all that I had overcome, this new life that I had earned for myself. It could all be undone by opening this toy box. I shouldn't open it. I should throw it in a landfill and forget it ever existed. I should not look inside. I opened the chest. I never had a doll. My mother never could afford to buy me one. I never had a wagon either, for that matter. But I did have a toy box, a pretty, blue and white toy box. And when I was 5, I beat my little sister to death and put her in it. Bigger Fish. Posted by Won't Think Straight. Well, boys, let's talk. Malcolm grinned through a beard that looked like a mangy kitten had stuck to his face. Do you have those ciggies for me? This was the last of our 3 meetings with Malcolm. A model inmate, he was exceedingly polite and friendly, a stark contrast to the violent murders he was imprisoned for. I had agreed to help Steve with his postgraduate psychology thesis. This involved some field work interviewing dozens of patients. Most were fairly mundane, a couple were truly horrifying. And Malcolm's was by far the most memorable. The interview had been set up by Steve's mentor, a jovial Dr. Mackenzie. He thought it would be both a valuable experience and a character-building exercise to meet someone with a deeply disturbed past. As an added bonus, he would be amused to have Steve squirm a little. So here I was locked in with a psychopath. Because friends don't let friends accidentally get murdered doing homework. Our first meeting with Malcolm was unproductive, our thoughts mostly focused on trying not to get killed. As the interviewer, Steve was too self-conscious, too careful in avoiding saying the wrong thing, or making sudden movements that might be misinterpreted as a provocation. In reality, we had nothing to fear. Though he confessed to the murder of 6 people 4 years ago, Malcolm had not shown the slightest violent tendency since. His good behavior had earned him the privilege of participating in this program. As Malcolm never had visitors, he was very pleased to finally have some. The second meeting a week later was more relaxed. Malcolm opened up about his childhood. He was an only child in a middle-class family in the middle of suburbia. A rebellious youth, he had run away from home at 17 to elope with a girl his parents disapproved of. For 2 years, they roamed the country taking up odd jobs: short-order cook, bussing tables, minor theft, until she got bored and left him for a richer fling. Heartbroken, he endured a few more years of drifting until his stubborn pride relented, and he made his way back home to ask his parents for forgiveness. He came back to find a foreclosed sign on a derelict house. His parents had spent their fortune searching for him, until they were tragically killed in a car accident a year earlier. He spent the next few years drowning his guilt with whiskey, using up what little remained of his inheritance. On the night of his 34th birthday, he had stumbled to a wharf to drown himself more permanently. Sitting on that dock, swigging the last of his Jack Daniels, he also drank in the serenity of his surroundings. The boats bobbing up and down gently on the water, the twinkling lights reflecting playfully off the surface, the gentle lapping sound of waves against the pier. He gazed at the horizon that beckoned with the promise of things yet to see and experience. He decided wasn't ready to go yet, or perhaps he was too cowardly to go. He wanted to live. He didn't find God, but he did find hope, a reason to live. So he sobered up, worked steadily, and saved up until he could afford a small fishing boat that doubled up as his home. He loved to travel over that horizon when he could, and drop his fishing lines, and just enjoy life on the water. There were many other things he wanted to see and do, but they would have to wait until he saved more money. But now at our third and final meeting, we wanted to know just one thing. What drove Malcolm to brutally kill Todd Weber, his wife Tracy, their sons Jack and Ryan, their uncle Bill, and another victim that could not be identified from the remains? We had to know what made Malcolm snap. Steve handed Malcolm the open box of cigarettes. Malcolm grabbed them giddily and took a good whiff. "Thanks, boys. These'll do nicely," he grinned, putting the box away in his pocket. Malcolm didn't smoke, but many of the inmates did. No doubt that box will buy him a few favors. So you'll be wanting to know what happened that night then, eh? Yeah, why did you do those things in the police report? Steve pushed his body forward in his chair and pressed his arched fingers against his lips. Ah, you've read the report then. You already know what happened. The official court filings duly noted that Malcolm had confessed to the murders and pleaded insanity. A straightforward case, given the crime scene they found. We've done our research, yes. We've gone through the court transcripts, but you never gave a motive. You never explained why you did it. Malcolm slumped back in his chair, and his body language noticeably shifted to one of apprehension as he crossed his arms and started chewing on his nails. He stared intently at the security camera in the corner of the ceiling for several moments, furiously debating with himself in his mind. Finally he whispered, "Okay. I'll tell ya. I've wanted to tell someone, but couldn't. If you tell anyone else though, I'll deny it and tell 'em you're crazy, okay?" Steve exchanged glances with me, then nodded calmly. I leaned forward with a pen in my sweaty hands, ready to start furiously scribbling notes, as Malcolm closed his eyes and retold his story. It was a chilly Saturday night. I was in happy mood. I'd just filled Smoother Sailing, his boat, with fuel. I was gonna take her out to my favorite fishing spot. I upped anchor at 8 p.m. and pushed off the wharf, hitting full throttle when I got to open waters. My spot was 3 hours away, but I don't mind. I love the sailin', that feeling of cold air and sea spray rushing over you. You know what that feeling is? It's being alive. I hadn't felt that in a very long time. Visibility that night was great, and there wasn't a cloud in the sky. Being winter and all, there weren't any other boats about. Was just me, the sea and the stars. Just the way I liked it. Around 9:30 my radar picked up another boat about 5 miles ahead. I never saw anyone out there in deep waters that time of night before, so I went to check it out. It was on the way anyway. Closing in, I saw the glow of a sweet-looking yacht, one of them millionaires' boats. All fancy and slick and big and lit up like a Christmas tree. It must have been an 80-footer. She was a real looker. I throttled back to get a good peek along her starboard side. She was the Mary C. I could see her name tattooed all fancy like on that classy ass of hers. A couple of guys were on the deck and a family inside the cabin setting up dinner. I waved a neighborly hello as I sailed by, but only the guys on deck saw me. They just stared and wrinkled their nose like I was some bad smell. So I changed my hand wave to an extended middle finger and sped off laughing. No way I was letting them spoil my mood. I finally made it to my spot and baited my lines and dropped them in the water. I sat back and enjoyed my fishing in peace for a few hours. I was hoping to stay there the whole weekend, but a storm warning flashed up. Not wanting to be caught in a storm so far from the harbor, I pulled up me lines up, made me way back. I did catch a good pink snapper, so it wasn't a wasted trip. I was a bit surprised to see the Mary C pop up on the radar again on my return route. It was around 4:30 a.m. now, and she hadn't moved at all. Getting closer, I could see she was still lit up, but something was wrong. There was a big dent along the starboard waterline, and she was leased in slightly port side. I thought she may be too keen on water. I got in close and yelled out for the crew. Didn't hear anything back but the waves slapping against boat. I circled round slowly and checked the radio for distress signals. There was nothing on any of the frequencies. A lifeboat was still rigged up port side, untouched. The crew would still be on board. I maydaid the Coast Guard and moored me boat to the back of the yacht. There was a board and ladder I climbed to get to the deck. The lights were all on, so I yelled out again. No answer. Nothing. The deck seemed normal. Some half-drunk glasses of wine on the table and some untouched food. Nothing unusual. I went into the cabin and noticed that the doors were busted. like something big crashed into them from the inside trying to get out. The wooden frame was all splintered. I yelled out again to see if everyone was all right. Still no sound. Inside her was another table set up with dinner. Everything was still laid out neat, no sign of struggle or trouble. Like the crew just vanished as they were tucking in. There was a galley next to the dining cabin. It was messy, but no different to what you'd expect after cooking. I could smell faint onions and meat in the air. Ahead was the forward cabin with the ship's navigation and a large lounge area. I was trying to check out the ship's log when I heard a sudden crashing sound behind me, back where the dining table was. I rushed back there, but it was only some glasses slipping off the table. The boat was now at a pretty bad angle. I saw some stairs leading down to the crew quarters and thought I'd quickly check him out. You know, before the ship sunk, just in case there were people trapped and needing help. Heading down, the carpet was already wet with sea water on one side. I went down the corridor knocking on rooms and opening doors and yelling out for anyone who could hear. At the end was the master bedroom. I should have left the boat then and there. I wish I never opened it. There are some things that are just better left unknown. But it had seemed empty like all the others at first. But I noticed some small shoes under some drapes, like some kid was hiding behind them. I walked up slowly, whispering, "Hey kid. It's all right, there's nothing to be scared of, but we need to leave now." I got no response, not so much as a twitch. So I got in real close, then ripped the drapes away. There was no kid there. Just his shoes. And his severed feet still in them. Like something had ripped him from his body. I fell back and gagged. I ran into the ensuite to throw up, then saw the mirror was covered in blood. I stepped back and slipped on the wet floor. But it was blood, not seawater. I had the blood all over me. I saw 4 more shoes lined up in the bath, with severed feet still in them like the first. I screamed and ran as fast as I could back up the stairs. Near the top I heard someone yell out to me. I was screaming and babbling, but they eventually calmed me down and cuffed me. The Coast Guard had arrived. They did a quick inspection and found more severed feet. They were in the closet of 2 of the other rooms I had checked out. They transferred me to their boat and detained me while they searched smoother sailing. Near my bunk they found 1 more set of shoes and feet, another kid's. I couldn't explain how it got there. 12 shoes and feet in all, 6 different people. They charged me with murder and maritime piracy. When it got to my court hearing, I still couldn't explain what happened. I was the last person to see them alive. I was a thief in my youth, and was found uninvited on a rich guy's yacht. I had their blood all over me. Their remains were found on me boat. The Mary Sea had sunk by that mid-morning, taking any other evidence with it. What choice did I have but plead insanity? Malcolm seemed to have aged 20 years as he finished telling his story. But then he looked at us, smiled, and the age washed away, along with the weight on his shoulders. When our time was drawing to a close, the guard arrived and was cuffing him back to his cell. Steve still felt he needed some closure. "Hey Malcolm, so you didn't do it then? You don't have to be here. We can, we want to help you out. Clear your name." Malcolm only chuckled. "What makes you think I want to get out of there? I confessed, didn't I?" "But why? Why confess to something you didn't do? That's crazy. Think about this. I know I've had a long time to think it over. In here, it's not so bad. I'm watched 24 hours a day. Someone's always checking on me, watching carefully who comes in and out, making sure I'm safe. One thing fishing has taught me is no matter how good you think you are, there's a bigger fish out there ready and waiting to eat your lunch. Or eat you for lunch. And outside, well, that thing is still out there. And still hungry. Out there, you have no one watching over you all the time, making sure you're safe. So who do you think is really crazy, eh? That was the last we saw of Malcolm,